Okay, so we're joined here by probably the most frequent guest that's been on the podcast, Andy Bellavia. The most recent time, though, was a year ago. I just looked it up. It was episode 76, where you came on as a solo episode back in July. And prior to that, you were on a number of other times. So, welcome back to the podcast, Andy. Thanks a lot for joining me, episode 100 here. Andy is a longtime commentator and kind of inside expert of everything that's been going on, particularly around the hearables and the hearing health space, both from a technical standpoint, but also from sort of like a overarching thematic standpoint as well. So thank you for joining me. Just wanted to have you on to ask you, in all the different areas that you're interested in, the things that you're sort of observing, what's on your radar? What are you excited about with what's on the horizon?
Well, first off, Dave, congratulations on 100 episodes. And I really appreciate you having me on and being a part of it. I mean, you've really done a lot in this space in 100 episodes, and it's amazing. I'm looking forward to the next 100 episodes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
In terms of what's the most exciting thing that I'm seeing happening in my area, it's the imminent release of the over-the-counter hearing aid rule here in the US, but not actually for the reasons you might think, because in the near term, I don't believe OTC will make much of an impact in this country because it doesn't address one of the key issues that drives the low uptake of hearing loss treatment, and that's the stigma. Or maybe to put it another way, it's the fact that people don't do anything about it until it gets so bad, whereas over-the-counter is really going to be most effective in the earlier stages of hearing loss. What I'm really excited about is that OTC is driving a conversation and it's driving developments. This process has gone on for a long, long time, and a whole lot of things are happening around it. Really, people are becoming more aware of hearing loss and different ways of treating hearing loss and the importance of treating hearing loss. And a lot of that came out of all of the discussions, even going back to the PCAST, on the need for an over-the-counter hearing device. And what I see today actually is that there are two parallel paths running, both part of this process. And one path is the increasing availability of non-regulated hearing features in true wireless earbuds. We've talked about this before. I mean, take hearing personalization. That's just simply giving the user a hearing test and then personalizing the sound of the music. And so now it's a non-threatening way to introduce people to taking a hearing test, learning what their hearing is, and then immediately getting positive feedback in the form of better music quality. And so now you have a very non-threatening way of introducing people to the benefits of better hearing. And then not behind that really is other hearing features outside of amplification, like beamforming mics, in the speech and extracting speech from noise, algorithms, and the like. So Apple really is ahead here, I would say. And they've got what they call the conversation boost, and they've got noise reduction, all these things. And so you imagine now a person who isn't thinking much about hearing at all, they've personalized their music and they realize the music sounds better. They go to a loud place and they flip them into restaurant mode and they can hear better in restaurant mode. So now they're getting a lot of positive and rewarding feedback by addressing their hearing without really thinking about addressing their hearing. They haven't said, I have hearing loss, I must go to an audiologist. They simply exploited the modes of their earbuds and start to realize the benefit. So I think that's going to have a much more positive impact on people's attitudes towards hearing loss than OTC hearing aids specifically, but they're all coming out of that same set of conversations. Realization that hearing loss has to be dealt with at all levels.
Yeah, that's very well said.
Once you start thinking about hearing personalization and beamforming mics and all that, it's really just a small leap, except for the regulatory process. But other than that, it's a small leap to actually offering OTC and consumer level devices. So you could see things really starting to evolve. And of course, the end benefit of all that is that you're going to be able to reach more people in more places.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all that. And I probably should have mentioned too at the top when I introduced you is that another thing that I think really makes your perspective valuable and unique is that you are a hearing aid wearer. And I think you kind of fit that archetype of someone who waited too long, like self-admittedly, you would say that. And part of that though, I think, was that, you know, you sort of in a sense came from an era where these solutions weren't fully formed. And so let me ask you, you know, Andy, from 10 years ago, if you were presented with what's available today, how is that different from what you were presented with even 5 years ago or however long ago when you did take the plunge and decided to get hearing aids?
Yeah, it's hard to play revisionist history, especially
Right.
with yourself, but I could see myself trying one of those devices first when my hearing loss was milder. I mean, I was working right about the time, if I go back and try and think, when I first started to realize I was having difficulty in a restaurant situation or whatnot, was probably about the time I was working with the likes of Doppler Labs, who were first dipping their toe in those waters. And so if I put myself 5 years further forward, I might very well have tried those Dopplers in a crowded situation and said, hey, this is pretty good. But the technology just wasn't mature enough at that particular time, for me to take advantage of it. But I'll tell you what I do tell people, and this is a little bit off the topic. I just had a conversation with one of my colleagues a few days ago who was saying, he was actually talking with another person. I happened to come in on the conversation and saying that, yeah, I really need to get in and have my hearing checked and this and that. And I looked at him, I said, I'll tell you what, I waited about 7 years to do it, and I regret all of them. I said, just go get it done.
Yeah.
But I like to think about this OTC in global context as well. If you take top level numbers, the WHO in their hearing report last year, they said that there are more than 1.5 billion people with some level of hearing loss, and 430 million of them are debilitated by it. So now let's see how many hearing aids are sold annually. About 20 million. So that's 10 million people with hearing aids against 430 million people with debilitating hearing loss. It's 2.3%.
Right.
So it's really impossible to argue at any level that today's system of hearing care delivery is capable of addressing the global need. Absolutely not. And given the impact untreated hearing loss has on quality of life, productivity, risk of comorbidities, I mean, something has to be done about this. So like I said, you're in a position like me, I tell people, go see an audiologist. I mean, I'm the first one to say, I'm now seeing an audiologist who uses best practices, and I'm hearing better than ever before. It's perfect, but I'm the top of the pyramid
Right.
in global hearing loss, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, because most people don't have the means and they don't have the access, then it becomes much more impossible to service people in the same way that I've been serviced. And I'll go to the WHO again, the WHO again, okay? They, in the same World Hearing Report, they reported on the density of audiologists in 102 countries, okay? 102 countries, 65 of them have less than 5 audiologists per million people, and 38 of them have less than 1. So the audiological model doesn't even work in a significant portion of the world. And even in the US, I had seen several of these sorts of surveys. In preparing for this, I ran across one by a researcher named Ariana Marie Planey. She published the paper. I haven't read the paper yet, but she had tweeted a map of the state of Illinois, which is my home state. And in that map, for those of you listening, you'll have to trust me on this. In that map, it shows vast swaths of Illinois that don't have any audiologists at all. It's a big state. It's about 390 miles or 628 kilometers long, and it's mostly rural. Outside of the Chicago area, it's mostly rural. And there are big patches of the state where there are no audiologists, and that's in the US. And there was also an article written in Hearing Tracker by Scarlett Lewitt. You might have seen it because it just came out. And it's called Where Are All the Audiologists? A UK Perspective on the Scarcity of Hearing Care Services. So even in countries like the UK and the US, there's a scarcity of audiologists. Okay, and that's not even counting the developing world. So that's really a key issue. The global pandemic of untreated hearing loss doesn't get solved on the model we have today. And so what I believe is that for people who don't have access or the means, a 70% solution is better than no solution at all. And insistence on best practices audiology is the only solution worldwide just isn't going to work. But on the other hand, you can't just throw some OTC devices on the internet and expect that to solve the problem either. It's not going to solve the problem at all. Because in many places in the world, people have no access to those devices, don't know what they are, aren't capable of properly using and fitting them on their own. It's just not going to work. So what I see is the second stream that goes parallel to OTC is alternate ways of delivering care. I'll use as an example a UK company called Timpa Health. This is on their website, they define their mission, and I'm quoting here, to empower allied healthcare professionals to provide ear and hearing healthcare diagnostics and treatment to local communities. So it's allied healthcare professionals. And they manufacture a handheld device that has an otoscope, microsuction, and hearing screening, all in a nice little handheld, looks like it's a smartphone-based device. And they also can link to an ENT or an audiologist if a local clinician, needs a second opinion on a complicated case. So let me use Honduras as an example. I travel to a rural area in the southern part of Honduras periodically, and we stay at a small town called Nacaome. It's got a few thousand people in it. And a lot of people live in the countryside around the town. It's pretty rugged, and the most common form of transportation is either on foot or by horse. And goods are often moved with carts pulled by horses or oxen. So not a lot of cars, and it's away from everything. There's a few audiologists in the country, but they are by car hours away. And so people who live in this region have no access to hearing care at all. But there are local health clinics in the region. And so imagine a clinic in a town like Nacaome, where they've got a Timpa device and the healthcare providers there have been trained in using it. Now imagine also that they have access to OTC-like devices. And I'm not actually thinking about the kind of devices we're seeing today. They would really have to be less expensive hearing-oriented devices, which is actually possible. There is in India, for example, a large earphone manufacturer called Boat, and they do a lot of true wireless devices. Their cheapest device in US dollar terms today is like $13, manufactured in India. Okay, so now a hearing device, which isn't doing all the bells and whistles that we expect, it doesn't necessarily have to have the best ANC and top music quality and all that, but it does have to have hearing related functions as an OTC device. Those could be manufactured relatively inexpensively, and therefore would be much more serviceable in a place like Honduras for treating people with mild and moderate hearing loss, which is the bulk of people anyway. And conceivably, that could even extend into the lower end of severe under that idea of being a 70% solution is better than a 0% solution. So you could refer out the most severe cases if people were capable of, traveling and getting a full-on hearing aid, but you're going to serve a large portion of the uncorrected hearing aid population just at the local clinic with these kinds of tools. And so that to me is what's really the most exciting thing about what got kicked off with OTC and is now leading in a lot of different directions. And now we have both the means and the technology to start to service the world's population. That's what excites me more than anything else.
Yeah, no, I love that answer. And I share the same enthusiasm as you about this, because you're absolutely right. I mean, so much of what's discussed on this show and just in the industry, broadly speaking, in the hearing health industry, is so American centric or European centric, maybe a little bit of an Asian focus, but there's parts of the world that what we're talking about isn't even applicable to. And so I agree with you that, when we look at the more macro level trends that are occurring right now, you have the world is being connected to the internet. I think it's somewhere like 80% of the world now has some level of internet access. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember verbatim what that statistic is, but there's obviously this big effort by companies like Google and Facebook and SpaceX and all these different
Mhm.
companies that are really attempting to provide internet access to every single portion of the world and all these different people. And you combine that with just the smartphone adoption, whether it be in the US, you have the iPhone is the dominant handset, but then in other parts of the world, like you mentioned, India or parts of Africa, where it's a $20 Android device. And so what I'm getting at is I think that a lot of the building blocks are there for these self-fit solutions to be much more, I think, broadly applied to large portions of underserved people. And that's, I think, only going to create a positive effect. And the other thing I think it's going to do is, um, I don't know if there's all that much incentive in the US, for example, to develop these types of solutions. They very well might be developed in other parts of the world and then make their way over to the US, where there's a real market in these more impoverished parts. But then it sort of gets fleshed out. And it's not necessarily just the device, it's a lot of the diagnostics. You mentioned Timpa Health, where the first company that came to my mind was like what Herex is doing, or
Mhm.
Kudo Wave or Shoebox,
Yep.
having these tablet screeners and diagnostic tools that can be performed by a nurse, an occupational therapist, all these allied professionals, like you mentioned. So it's not necessarily, I think, just the innovation and the proliferation of the hearing devices per se. It's also everything that goes along with it in terms of determining where you fall sort of on that spectrum. And the last piece to this is, I think, the um, basically the iOS and the Android carriers having profiles and a history logged. I mean, I think Apple's out front in a big way here. It'll be interesting to see if Google follows suit with everything Android's doing in Android Health. But with Apple Health, to your point, in the colleague that you were speaking about, where go and see an audiologist today, would it not be more beneficial to not only be able to go see an audiologist, but have that information logged and then be able to use it as a benchmark, so that when you go and you choose not to pursue anything that first time, but you go 1 year later and you can see how it compares 1 year from time. You know what I'm saying? I'm getting at, like, we're gonna just, I think, become way more informed of what's everything about our hearing health, I think, is going to be part of our um mindset of all things overall in our health, and have a better understanding of where we all, I think, individually fall, and how to make sure that we maintain the levels that we all kind of have, and not let them just completely deteriorate.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're going to have the infrastructure, the services, and the devices to serve everybody up and down the socioeconomic scale. So anything from what you just described, where you're using the Apple Health ecosystem and it's monitoring your hearing health along with everything else, down to a hearing device for a person who doesn't have a smartphone. Okay. And I've seen plenty of people without phones in this area of Honduras. So, like, we'll take two representative people. A farmer up in the hills doesn't have a cell phone. Okay. But they go to the clinic, and I envision in this setting, it's mostly going to be clinician fit, not self-fit. But it's going to be a self-fitting device, but supervised by a clinician. So they don't need all the programming tools and that sort of thing, right? And they will link up to their mobile phone, and have the client supervised, run the fitting software after they check to make sure they have the right ear tips and so on, give them education on its use, fit the device, and they're off and running as a hearing device, not necessarily connected to a phone and internet connected, but it's a hearing device. Now you take, say, a shopkeeper in the town. Well, in all the shops, their mobile phone is their business phone. So they all have mobile phones. So that hearing device, it has to be Bluetooth connectable anyway for the programming. But then it's also Bluetooth connected, so the shopkeeper can answer the phone and hear better and talk to people who call on the phone. and also be able to interact in a better way with their customers in person. Because when you have untreated hearing loss, it really places a big burden on your productivity whenever you have to talk to people if you can't understand them. That's if you're working in a production facility or you're working in a shop where you're interacting with customers. You have to be able to hear them properly in order to be successful. So in both of those cases, you would have this sort of device, but not necessarily self-fit, clinician fit, but not necessarily audiologist fit. And of course, even in a local clinic in their tablet or what have you, they can be keeping records of their clients. And thanks for mentioning the other companies. I use Timfa just as one example, but there are a lot of people approaching this problem from different angles. And that's what makes me believe that we're finally at the cusp of being able to really do something here.
Yeah.
It takes the political will also, right? The local governments who are providing healthcare services, they have to be willing to support hearing health. But when it becomes more affordable, you have a greater chance of them doing it. And of course, there's also the opportunity for NGOs to get more involved in this activity as well. But until now, none of the infrastructure devices existed to even think about doing it. And at least now that is rapidly coming into place.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with everything there. I mean, again, just to reiterate, I think that this whole like diagnostic piece is so fascinating to me, where you're kind of seeing a lot of what the audiologist does today is being extended and made available by other allied professionals. And I think it just broadens the science of audiology. And I think that's a really positive thing. I really think that we're short-sighted to think that there is a finite limited of opportunities or something like that. I mean, to your point, there's so many people out there that need some level of amplification. And I think that what's really, really exciting is this convergence of like I said, some really major macro trends like internet connectivity and smart device proliferation. But you tie that with a lot of this, what's happening, I think, is OTC is more of just kind of a catalyst of like opening things up. And,
Exactly.
I think that's going to there's going to be some really cool dividends that are realized, I think, over the next few years as we really see parts of the world, in a sense, come online in this space in I think, a big way. And it becomes just even more top of mind of how important hearing loss is to address at scale.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Fantastic. Well, Andy, thank you for being such a big part of Future Ear for our first 100 episodes. I hope to have you on for the next 300 episodes. So thanks so much. I really appreciate all your support and all the really great insight you've shared on the podcast so far.
Well, you're welcome. And thanks for that, Dave. And yes, I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to put in my calendar episode 400 to be ready.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.